Good afternoon. And welcome to this CASI event. CASI is a Corporation Society initiative here at the GSB. And CASI is a hybrid little initiative powered by staff, Tina and Lisa, myself, and a fellow faculty behind the scene, and especially our awesome student leaders who help us plan events, help us moderate events sometimes, and just do the marketing, which is how many of you got here. We do a little bit, but they do the most. We bring to campus conversations that we think should be had, that maybe don't happen enough in the classrooms, but that we feel are important, and so does everybody involved. Is everybody involved? I'm not going to take more time. It so happened today that the Leading with Value course was covering the writing of our two speakers. And so all of you who are business school students get to read what they wrote in the New York Times and then what they ended up putting in a book on McKinsey, but they do other writings as well. Very experienced investigative reporters who bring truth, and we care about truth and confronting the truth. And so I'm going to pass it on to one of our awesome leaders, Wes Cash, to take it from here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anat. Thank you, Anat, for the introduction. Our conversation today will begin with when McKinsey comes to town, but it will be about something much larger: how power operates behind the scenes, how decisions get made, and ultimately who's accountable behind these decisions. I am quite honored to moderate this discussion with our lovely guests, joined by two extraordinary journalists whose work has shaped our public understanding of many of these institutions. Walt Bogdanich is a 3-time Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter whose work has exposed corporate misconduct, medical fraud, and systematic failures across industries. Before joining the New York Times, he worked with the Wall Street Journal, Frontline, 60 Minutes, and ABC News, among others, and he has spent decades holding powerful institutions accountable. Michael Forsythe is an investigative reporter known for his reporting on global finance, elite networks, and political power, including years in Beijing and Hong Kong, uncovering corruption and hidden influence among some of the world's most powerful actors. His work brings a global lens to corporate secrecy and to public impact. You could say we have the best guests for this discussion today. In 2022, Walt and Mike published When McKinsey Comes to Town, the book that is in front of many of you today. An investigation into how one of the world's most powerful consulting firms has influenced everything from opioid marketing and ICE detention centers to corporate layoffs and major public institutions. Their reporting highlights not only individual scandals, but systemic issues that emerge when an institution with enormous reach operates largely behind closed doors. Please join me in welcoming Walt and Mike. You guys have quite the credentials, so that's a big introduction to get to for our lovely guests. Let's start just by polling the audience. How many of you here have worked in management consulting before or have recruited for it? Mix. And how many of you have never worked for or have never had interest? Great. So this does capture quite the diversity of the student body here and exactly what we're hoping to address today. So let's begin at the beginning. How did this work come to be? How did it start?
Well, it was unusual for me to take on something like this because I had done 40 years of reporting on really dirty, nasty corporations that were harming people, killing people. So why McKinsey? Why pick on, the squeaky clean company that no one had really said anything negative about? Well, it was because it's big, it's powerful, and it's secretive. And for journalists like Mike and me, that's catnip. Because when somebody's secret, we want to know what those secrets are. And it was a black box. And look, it was really an intimidating thought. I remember the night after we signed our contract to do the book thinking, how are we going to do this? We don't know anybody in McKinsey. They are totally secret. They don't disclose their clients. They don't disclose anything. I mean, they sign NDA. Well, you all know if you've worked over there what it's like. You're not supposed to talk to us. That's sort of one of the things. And so it was how are we going to do this? And so it was a sobering moment, at which point we decided to drink a little bit so it wasn't so sobering. and it just, it was something we wanted to do. And as journalists, when there is this powerful entity in society and no one is holding them accountable, that's our job.
So, Mike, maybe I can ask you, was there something at the beginning that said, there must be something here? I mean, there's a ton of secretive institutions, and I want to push on why did you first learn of McKinsey, and what led to that investigation?
So, I mean, it was Walt who started this out, and he tried to convince, the bosses at the New York Times that we should spend some time, resources, and when we say resources, mostly time, researching this company. And I'm speaking for Walt here, but he started looking at this in the aftermath of the 2016 election, trying to look at deeper reasons why Trump won in 2016, maybe societal issues and things. And that's when you cottoned on to McKinsey. And then you spent over a year, right, trying to convince the masthead, which we call the bosses at the C-suite of the New York Times. Not the C-suite, the news side C-suite, I guess, of the
By
New York
the way,
Times.
McKinsey, of course, advises the New York Times.
Yes,
So
yeah.
that's an important backdrop.
Not only that, but McKinsey's married into the New York Times. There's a senior partner at McKinsey who's married into the family that owns the New York Times and controls it. So this is what we're dealing with.
And one of the things I love about the company is at the time they were advising the New York Times, they were advising the Washington Post. So it's, here's how you beat the Post, here's how you beat the Times. So I thought that was an interesting situation.
Yeah. I imagine they didn't advise you both to write the book.
They encouraged us. No, I'm kidding.
We were counseled not to, but no, we weren't. They didn't say anything either way. And so anyway, finally, I think you got the green light from the old executive editor, Dean Baquet, to do this, and you needed a Toto to go along with your Lone Ranger to use it. And I was Toto, I guess. Not the Toto in that. Not the Dorothy's Toto, but the Lone Ranger Toto. Yeah. Anyway, so just to kind of explain, so this is long before we didn't entertain the idea of writing a book about these guys. It was more of an organic New York Times writing articles. Walt had heard about the difficulties McKinsey was having in South Africa. So this was in 2017 when we started reporting this. And then we did that story. That was our first story, and we, learning a lot about McKinsey at the time. And then it's kind of organic. It kind of snowballed after that. In researching that story, we learned about McKinsey's work with ICE. We learned about McKinsey's work with authoritarian countries around the world. So we had ideas for follow-on stories. When Jamal Khashoggi was killed or was dismembered and assassinated by Saudi Arabia, that started to look at McKinsey's work in Saudi Arabia. People started, I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves, but people from McKinsey then started coming forward and telling us their stories. And so we never really set out to write a book at all. It was just a reporting project.
And we followed our curiosity.
Yeah.
And so then you did write a book, and I'm sure many people here have read it, but for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet, how would you summarize the thesis of the book in terms of, each chapter is a different story, but there's clearly patterns throughout. How would you summarize your book?
Riveting. I can tell you how I should read this for laughs. I've got it here somewhere. It was okay, go ahead, Mike. I got to find this. Here it is. Okay. There are times, look, we were thrilled to have the great book reviews in the New York Times and the Washington Post, but there's times you really want someone just to be blunt and lay it on the line. So here's how the Sydney Morning Herald in Australia characterized our book. Quote, "Forget Stephen King or Edgar Allan Poe. If it's really a scary book you're after, bolt the doors, lock your windows, and curl up under the covers with a copy of When McKinsey Comes to Town. The McKinsey in question is not a bloodthirsty psychopath, but an international consulting company. And if you've never heard of them, well, unless you're rich and gullible, that's just the way they like it. You only have to ask McKinsey and Company for details on what it actually does for this to become clear. Its corporate slogan should be, "Our business is none of your business." So that's how they characterized it. I can't disagree too much with that.
If there's a common theme to the chapters in the book, that it is, I think most of these chapters have that common theme. It's that harm that is being done to the greater public, in each chapter. And I keep quoting you like you're like Kim Jong-un or something like this. But
oh, thank you.
Yeah.
My goodness.
So one of the things that Walt says a lot is, yes, my dear leader Walt says a lot is, as journalists, we write about the planes that crash, not about the planes that land safely. So, I mean, obviously, you're reading the book, and it's just one thing after another, and and so we are focusing, obviously, on the problems, the societal problems, from overseas. Half the book is written about things that McKinsey's doing overseas, which is interesting, but also a lot of domestic things, a lot of, in finance, in pharmaceutical and everything. And yeah, that's the common theme. And it's not to say, and I think we'll say this anyway, we're not the people who are going to tell you, don't work for McKinsey. I have one word for people who get a job offer at McKinsey, and that's congratulations. We're not those type of people that are just like cracking jokes about, consultants all day long, although there are many jokes to be cracked.
In fact, I have one here.
Yeah, got to put it, yeah.
May I?
You may.
Yes. There's a gentleman in a political cartoon standing in front of a PowerPoint saying, quote, "Enhanced branding metrics drive robust solutions for scalable monetization of jargon." So
yeah,
that's sort of how I think of, anyhow, look, a lot of our good friends still work there, and they love it there, and they hire people who are idealistic, who want to make the world a better place. Not everybody, but that's how you walk in the door, with these grand ambitions and beliefs that you can make a difference. And I'm probably getting ahead of myself, so pardon me. So when they see daylight between what they've been told walking in the door and the actions, that's when they might get frustrated and do get frustrated, and they call us, and we sort of step in.
Yeah, that's when we...
and do our best.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of this cognitive dissonance, it sounds like, between what prospective employees and employees have when they walk into major consulting firms and major institutions, and maybe what they face. What did you hear from the people who you spoke with, of which I think there were many leading to this book, about what that process was like for them, and maybe where they came to the realizations that the experiences they had weren't all that they were sold?
I mean, there were so many, in our book, and they informed so many of the chapters. For example, the chapter on McKinsey with ICE, McKinsey with Purdue Pharma, so many things. And almost to a T, the people who came to us are, people like you, generally younger, almost all younger, newer hires. And, McKinsey, in some ways, is almost a victim of its recruiting process because, and you guys are much more familiar with this than we are, but there are case studies, during your McKinsey, recruiting process that give you these like moral, issues, that deal with, how are you going to, some maybe dealing with environmental issues. How do you distribute vaccines in Nigeria? Things like this. McKinsey does try to sell itself, to young people, associates, and as a moral firm that does good. And if you are hired by McKinsey, you might be able to actually be involved in these projects and make the world a better place. And so if you come to McKinsey and you find yourself not doing that, and you find yourself maybe working, and this wouldn't happen anymore because they don't do this anymore, but working for Purdue Pharma and try to boost OxyContin sales, or trying to find ways for ICE to make the deportation process more efficient, things like that. Those people, I think there's, they have a real cognitive dissonance with that. They have a real problem with that. And that's when they come to us. And it was many people. So I'm so glad they did. Yeah.
And do you think that's shared? I mean, one of the kind of clear theses in the book or underlying themes is that McKinsey's everywhere and we don't see it, right? It's involved in the New York Times, it's involved in so many of the major corporations of the world. How would you respond to someone who says, these chapters each exemplify bad situations that happen, but are to some extent inevitable when an organization is such a behemoth and influencing so many major institutions across the world? Is this just a series of really unfortunate engagements, or is there something systemic that's underlying this, either about McKinsey, about consulting, or about the people it hires?
Mike?
I do think there's
I mean, I've got thoughts, but
yeah, I think there is a systemic
I just
issue.
bring the jokes to the table. He does the serious stuff. Go ahead.
So, and this is where actually more senior people came to us and talked to us. There was a guy who is a longtime senior partner in China who talked about how, and we heard this over and over again from partner and senior level people at McKinsey, that the firm had grown too much. And as you probably, most of you know, it's kind of modeled on a law firm. And so the individual fiefdoms in cities and in countries have an incredible amount of autonomy, like a law firm would. And this is purpose designed by the real founder of McKinsey, who's not James McKinsey, but this guy Marvin Bower, who was a lawyer, and he set it up that way. And as the firm grew and grew and grew and grew, and these fiefdoms grew all across the world, in China and Germany and elsewhere, there was also an extreme need to raise more money because people were demanding higher salaries. They saw their roommates from Harvard go to Goldman Sachs and are making millions of dollars a year. Here I am at this woolly, McKinsey, this consulting firm. I'm not making that much. Why not? So with the increased financialization of the United States, there was a more demand for salaries. You have to feed the beast. And because it's so decentralized, because it's so big, because the partners didn't know each other anymore, and this is where I'm telegraphing what these partners were telling us, that these decisions got made around the world and in the United States that they really didn't have a good handle on. And so mistakes were made, and that's a systemic issue.
Yeah, and to address the question a little more seriously, in every McKinsey office, as those of you who have worked there know, the values are on the wall. And as recently as we checked in, the number one value was, put your client's interest first. And that sounds really good. And on one level, you should pay, they're hiring, they're paying you the money. But when your client is Purdue Pharma or some evil corporation doing bad things, then that's not a good policy to follow. And I think that was taken a little bit too rigidly by the people in the firm, that we're going to do what we're asked to do, and we're not going to be judgmental about it. We were merely consultants. We're not running the company, we're advising it. And which was convenient for them when bad things happened, because then they could always say, well, all we did is make suggestions. We didn't execute the decisions. So that's on the backs of the executives. So that is one sort of systemic reason for their behavior.
And this idea of we don't do policy, we do execution, comes up again and again and again, both in the book and in the broader coverage that you both have done on McKinsey. When there's a professional services firm, whether it's McKinsey or law firms or big four tax companies, what are their obligations? Are they to their clients? Are they to broader society? And how do they balance them when they conflict?
Well, that's a question that they have to deal with, and sometimes they make the right decisions, and sometimes they don't. As we mentioned earlier, I think in our private conversation, about you don't check your ethics at the door, your own humanity at the door. You have to bring that into play, and you have to speak out. Look, I know we've been criticized by certain people that we just had this collection of horror stories. We tried to bring out some of the good things that McKinsey does, and we said that, look, there's no question that they do good. The question is, can they do less harm? And I guess that's sort of a summary. I don't know if I answered your question.
Let me push on that for a
Yeah.
second. This is a collection of horror stories, and that is the work of investigative reporters to uncover horror stories. But what is the good that you see coming out of McKinsey?
Well, that'll be the second book.
Yeah.
We haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, Wes, I do want to address your first question, though, because I mean, I think there really is a big difference when you look at professional services firms between consulting firms, accounting firms, and law firms, because, as that, a U.S. attorney from the Eastern District of Virginia is finding out so painfully now, there are rules and laws, that govern the legal profession. In the accounting, there are rules and laws that govern the accounting profession, and there are, very strict obligations in both accounting and law about client confidentiality. And everybody needs an accountant. Every company needs an accountant. Every company needs a lawyer, and every person involved in a legal dispute needs a lawyer. But consulting is completely optional, and it's also the one place where there is no professional set of rules or laws, that you can't be disbarred as an accountant. So there's a real difference. So I think, because there is that difference, it does make looking at these firms, I think, a little more complicated.
Yeah, so maybe it's not apples to apples here, right? Like one of the common themes that came in the book is McKinsey advises the FDA, and it also advises Purdue Pharma at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's no sense of getting waivers for working on the other side of the same deal. Right. And McKinsey chooses to self-regulate to some extent. Mm-hmm. Is the solution here in regulation? Or is it in reforming the organization? I want to push us just from describing the problems to thinking a little bit more about what we would want to see come out of it.
Well, I don't think that there has been any kind of general agreement on how to fix things in consulting or corporations in general. I mean, I'm just finishing reading a wonderful book, The Black Edge, about the rise of, Stevie Cohen and how his SAC Capital made all this stuff. There are decisions we have to make every day as to what's right, what's wrong. But, it comes down to individuals. I mean, I don't know that the government is going to be able to be the answer here. And we've seen the job that the government does, or what's left of the government. I know it's a bit of a cop-out, but in a sense it's not. I mean, we bring our own values to the job, and we have to speak up, and we have to defend them, and have the courage to speak out. And that can be hard. I know as a journalist, when I'm writing something, and the editor wants it stronger and starts, I said, no, we can't do that. You have to stand up for what you believe and what's right. And that's where it begins. I'll let more, wise people figure out the larger solutions.
I mean, so there is an element of self-regulation, I guess, because as a result of pressure, reports in the New York Times and elsewhere about them, so McKinsey has taken some steps. They no longer work for the opioid industry or the tobacco industry. They do have a new system which has a great acronym that I forget about evaluating new clients and evaluating whether it's good or beneficial to the firm to take on these clients, or whether there'd be too big of an issue legally or morally to do that. They say they have that system, so they've taken some steps. But as far as government regulation or anything, I don't know. But one thing for sure, as a journalist, we would always say is when it comes to government contracts, where there is an obligation for transparency, that we no longer see these redacted. They seem to have this mindset at McKinsey that we don't have to disclose the details of our work when it comes to government, which, as journalists,
that's in fact written into many of the contracts that they have with the government for HHS and other things, where they say you are not telling this part of the contract, you are not allowed to use any of the information that we use without getting our approval first. Mm-hmm. And so when we FOI, Freedom of Information Act requests, we get these documents back and it's all redacted. Key parts are redacted. McKinsey, determines, instead of the government, which is wrong, what should be public and what's not. So that's frustrating, but all it does is encourage us to dig deeper. So,
And that maybe is exactly where the power of investigative reporting comes in, right? To uncover these black boxes of information.
There's one quality that's, I think, most common among the best investigative reporters, and we like to say it's a low threshold of indignation. That is what I think we have, and our colleagues who are successful at it have, is that, we get ticked off when we see things that aren't right, and we want to do something about it. I mean, there's signs in the New York City, public transportation where it says, if you see something, say something. A lot of people walk by things and they won't say something. They'll see something that's not right. We try and train ourselves to look at it and stop and think and say, what's wrong with this picture and what can we do about it?
And in an era where that kind of sense of curiosity for looking at what's wrong and exposing it is happening more and more in situations like this, but is getting read less and less, and there's less trust around journalism, maybe for much of the fear that journalism is this kind of black box itself. You mentioned that McKinsey advises the New York Times or has historically. How do you feel about, or what do you think about kind of the role journalism is playing in exposing wrongs like this, but also in kind of the broader system of trust that we're seeing in our society?
Well, I think one of the great tragedies of our time is that people no longer really believe what they read. How are we going to fix the problems that we have if they don't believe journalists who are committed to the truth without fear or favor, best version of the truth? If you don't believe that, and then what are you going to do? I mean, I think it's a tragic situation, but investigative reporting continues. I mean, in other places too. So I don't think it's going to go away.
Yeah, I mean, it's as horrifying as it is that people don't believe media anymore, or investigative journalism, very edited, thought out pieces. They still break through, and more people know about McKinsey and the issues that McKinsey has had, such as with Purdue Pharma, than ever before, and it does get out, and it does affect change.
So there were changes made in McKinsey in response to the public outcry, and to their credit, those changes were made. A better review before hiring, taking on clients, et cetera, et cetera. But I need to point out that the managing partner who did that, who pushed for it, was immediately voted out after one term, which hadn't happened in decades. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure what conclusions you can draw from that, but one of them is not a good one. That maybe there is an interest in just the money machine, and let's keep the game going.
When we think of just this, a system of incentives, a black box, a system in which maybe optimizing on the small moments isn't what's good for society at large, I want to come back to our question of who gets to decide. When we think of advising major government institutions, international, many countries abroad, how do you think about the interplay between these private consulting firms that are working in strictly confidential terms and government institutions more broadly? The idea of democratic norms.
So for our book, we really focused, on the international side, on governments, with authoritarian governments. But of course, McKinsey works extremely closely with, democratic governments around the world. Britain, Germany, the United States, basically every country, except maybe not Australia anymore. They had a huge scandal on Australia, got kicked out. But I don't even know how to address your question, but it is striking in all these countries how McKinsey's partners and senior partners have really nurtured close relations, with some of these very powerful lawmakers. In Germany, when Ursula von der Leyen, when she was the defense minister, for example, she had forged a very close tie with some of these McKinsey people, and three of her kids, she had 7 kids, went to work for McKinsey. And you see this in France, and people sometimes view McKinsey almost as a finishing school for the children of billionaires. And you could just, in India, the Ambani family, their kids, did a stint at McKinsey. In France,
in
Ukraine. In Ukraine.
Yeah.
So there's this marriage, and I mean, we're not conspiracy theorists or anything, but it is striking how in country after country, the son-in-law of the Chinese premier was a McKinsey consultant. It's just striking the marriage of elites in government and the families of elites in government with McKinsey. And I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
if I can make one observation that I think will cast a favorable light on McKinsey. Having watched that horrible scene of all these executives, genuflecting in front of Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, and Trump. I mean, this is a guy who chopped up a journalist. And there were all these executives who came and paid homage to this guy in this golden, fancy dinner. McKinsey didn't go. And for that, I can't claim credit, but I'm proud of them for not doing so.
I don't think they were invited. It's just a guess.
They have a lot of business over there. Yeah, I think they probably. Who knows? I don't know.
I guess what I really want to come back to though is maybe not in McKinsey's role in autocratic governments, but rather McKinsey's role in making decisions day to day for clients that are behind the scenes. Right? They are advising clients in almost every government agency you can imagine, and in almost every industry. And so I guess the core of the question is, when we think about who's actually making these decisions, who's responsible for decisions, is it the executives at these Fortune 500 companies? Is it the elected officials in our government? Or is it the McKinsey business analysts who are hired out of places like this and making calls? How do you kind of distinguish between that responsibility and that accountability?
Well, it's tough to know what role exactly McKinsey plays in these decisions because they move ghost-like through these things, and they don't leave any tracks. So it's hard to know. But they really exist to some degree in providing cover for people in the C-suite who have to make difficult decisions. We want to lay off 1,000 people. Well, McKinsey told us that that's what we should do. So there is that. I don't know if that answers the question.
There is also in authoritarian and democratic countries alike, and you guys probably know some of this firsthand, oftentimes a consultant is actually seconded to a ministry, right? And so you're actually making decisions. Sometimes you have an email address, a .gov or .gov.sa email address. That was certainly the case in Saudi Arabia with a company that McKinsey bought out. They don't do a lot of M&A. They generally grow internally, but they have been buying some companies, and they bought a Saudi consulting company called Elixir, which actually embedded its consultants in ministries. Yep. But this also happens in places like Australia as well. So that's a real blurring, between government decision making and the consultants, when the consultant is actually effectively a government minister, or not a minister, but a bureaucrat.
And it's more than just money at stake here. I mean, as Mike pointed out through his knowledge of China and their role in building these islands in the South China Sea, McKinsey was advising to some degree on the building of these things, which posed militarily, a problem for our policymakers. Yet at the same time, they're advising the Pentagon, which didn't want this to happen. So these issues get complex, and you gotta stay on top of them to know what's happening.
Right, and this wouldn't happen at a law firm, right? Theoretically, because they have these conflicts. How many times have you been told, when you call a law firm, well, before we can comment on that, we've got to check to make sure we don't have any conflicts.
And one of the things McKinsey says, and consulting firms say more broadly, is, well, we have kind of this iron wall of information, right? That's, to your point, it's a decentralized organization. Our China office is working on what's happening in the South China Sea, and our DC office is working on advising the Pentagon. What would you say to that?
Well, that's what they say, you know. I mean, I think we're raised as journalists to be skeptical of that sort of thing. It doesn't look good. And if I were running the place, I wouldn't engage in that sort of potential conflict of interest, because trust is so important in what we do in our lives and how we run corporations and whatnot. You want that trust. And you don't do that when on the surface it looks like you're serving different masters.
Right.
So,
and when we do get disclosure, when the the light is shined on it, for example, with Purdue Pharma, we have privy to a whole bunch of internal McKinsey documents because of their settlement with the U.S. government and with the states, and so we could see in that instance, for example, at McKinsey, they say, well, we have these, Chinese walls. I hate that term, but they have these walls. If you're consulting for Ford, you can't consult for GM, right? But in one instance, there was a senior partner in McKinsey, Arnab Ghatak, who he was consulting for Purdue Pharma. At the same time, he was consulting for another another opioid maker, Endo Pharmaceutical. And then they were using in their pitches for clients, they were using, for pharmaceutical clients, they were using their ties to the FDA to get more clients. You should hire us because our consultants are also working with the FDA. We know that process. And we also learned from those documents that in some instances, the same consultants who were advising the FDA were also advising Purdue at the same time. And so, they can say some things, but when we are privy to all these documents, you can see a different story.
Right, you can't be on both sides of it. You can't have the confidentiality and use it to help you get more business.
Yeah.
A big issue with journalists, and should be with others in society, play an important role, is transparency. Because when we make decisions in society and politics, we kind of want the facts laid out on the table. And I think, the consultants need to do a better job at explaining their role and what they're doing. I'm not saying disclose corporate secrets. And I understand in this country, if you're advising General Motors, you don't want some of the stuff that you're telling them to be told to Ford. But when you're advising government agencies, that's a different story. And that really angers me. Because when they tell me I have no right to find out how tax dollars are being spent and what they're doing, that's just wrong. And so, that's my personal feeling.
And there's a lot in the book about this expansion into government and how that kind of changes. To your point, about half the book is about international work and a portion of that's on government work. Mm-hmm. It's been 3 years now since you published the book. And I imagine a lot has happened since then, both with McKinsey, with other consulting firms that we've seen. I'm interested in what some of the consequences have been, both intended and unintended, from the publication.
I mean, I wrote a couple names down. You don't want to ever become these people. One guy, I think he just finished his prison term. He was a senior partner at McKinsey, Martin Elling. On the Purdue Pharma case, those McKinsey, did settle with the government, and this guy did cop a plea, so he served prison term. Another guy, Vika Sagar, was a senior partner for McKinsey in South Africa, and Walt and I just a few weeks ago were at his sentencing in the Southern District of New York. He was lucky, and I think this may have something to do with the fact that the Trump administration, I don't know this for a fact, but the Trump administration is no longer enforcing FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. That's a matter of fact. I was in a Pam Bondi memorandum. This guy was not sentenced to any jail time, but he had been cooperating with the government. But his reputation is forever, shot to hell. So you don't want us to be writing about you. You want to, so there have been legal consequences.
Individuals have been held accountable.
Individuals have been held accountable. McKinsey's paid, I think, what is the running total now? It's well over $1.5 billion in fines to the federal government, to state governments, to municipal governments, and I think even to tribal governments as well. Yeah. So There's and in other countries like South Africa.
Look, full confession here, I was once sued for $10 billion for my reporting on Philip Morris and how they manipulated nicotine to keep people addicted. So, but in my case, I just paid it off and got it. Don't darken my doorstep.
Also a McKinsey
again.
client.
Oh yeah, McKinsey, yeah.
Yeah.
For many, many decades. See, McKinsey people are obviously very smart. Some of the smartest people around. They knew what tobacco was doing to people. They knew it was the most dangerous consumer product. They knew about opioids. That's the thing that really so troubling. It's not like they were ignorant or this was happening behind their backs. They knew exactly what they were doing. I don't think they woke up in the morning and saying, "Oh, I think I can kill a few more people." That's not what was happening. But you get you get the momentum going. You're working at a company. You want to keep your standing, and you stop thinking, judging what's right and wrong, and that's that's
clearly that happened at Purdue Pharma, and then the Philip Morris work too. So it was 1966, right? Or was it 64? The Surgeon General.
Yeah, but it was even before that.
People knew, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think it was 2016. We saw a slide deck from McKinsey to Altria, aka Philip Morris, about your app that you could have on your phone, your Philip Morris app. You're proposing this, and if the more cigs you buy, you can get these little trinkets, bottle openers and things like that. And they were pushing this and suggesting this to Philip Morris in 2016. They worked for tobacco companies until 2022.
And we read a lot about what's going on with gambling these days and a lot of the problems. And we reported in the book how McKinsey was advising Caesars on how to keep people at the gambling table when they were walking away after losing a bunch of money. In other words, these are people who had decided, I'd had enough, and McKinsey was advising Caesars on how to keep them there and get more of their money. That's something I would have a problem doing.
Understandably so. And I want to come back to the kind of lasting impact of the book here. Obviously, individual accountability is a portion of this. Publicity is a portion of this. And many, many more people are aware of McKinsey as a firm and consulting firms more broadly. But things like this are still happening. Just this past summer, BCG made national news and international news for their work in potentially advising nonprofits on how to relocate Palestinians out of Gaza. Bain has been in the news for other controversial things, and McKinsey continues to get its own coverage. Do you feel like there has been institutional change in this area of the economy? Do you have hope that things will get better?
No.
To both. No hope, no change.
I mean, I look at what's going on in the country today, and I can hope, but I mean, I'm sorry to. Do you disagree?
I think I'm more up. I mean, I do think. I'm a child of the '80s. I think it was a little bit more cynical time, and I do think, and I may just be completely wrong here, that young people today are more idealistic, and they came to us. They were upset about what they saw, and they came to us. So I mean, I guess if there's any room for optimism, it's that the future of the firm, these young people, that some of them are not going to take it, and that's how you affect change. And again, we're just talking about all the negative things. I'm taking almost as given that and so many of you, you've worked at McKinsey, you've worked at BCG, Deloitte, wherever. I mean, obviously, it's an excellent place to learn so much about business and how much how to it gives you as McKinsey says, a toolkit. They love that word, and so we're not denigrating that. And there are so many good things about McKinsey, and so many instances, where they've actually advised clients, and it's gone to their great benefit, including, I dare say, and you may take issue with this, Walt, the New York Times. So they were one of the advisors behind our digital, another buzzword at McKinsey, transformation. And that's obviously served, the New York Times very well. So, it's complicated, but I think our message would be, you've got to go into a firm like this with your eyes wide open. Yeah.
So with that, and kind of with the hope being with the young people, I think it'd be only opportune that we open it up to Q&A and hear from some of them.
Only young people can ask questions.
That's right.
All people
Or young
can
at
ask
heart.
questions.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, and we're going to pass a microphone around, I think, just to make sure it gets. No? Okay, yes.
So thank you both. Thank the three of you for doing this. I'm not a GSB student, so forgive me if my question is completely asinine, but this is a little bit of a hypothetical. Say there is an irreconcilable contradiction between what Mr. Bogdanich was saying with respect to, like, okay, sometimes you just got to do what's right, okay? You got to, like, have an ethical North Star, right? What if there is, in fact, an irreconcilable contradiction between that and fiduciary obligations? Which side wins?
I don't know what the fiduciary obligations are, for a consultant. I'm sorry, and you guys are going to really take issue with what I say. I think so much immoral behavior is shielded behind the term, it was my fiduciary duty, I couldn't do that. It becomes almost a catch-all in some instances, I think. And I know I'm really speaking out of my lane, but I see some nodding heads there too, So I've never even pondered your question. I mean, I just think if you see something wrong, you either quit, or you get reassigned, and or you come and talk to us, and I know that's not a satisfactory answer.
Works for me.
Yes.
Just on that note, I'm curious if Albert Bandura's moral disengagement as a framework has risen up in any conversations that you've had, and in what ways, if any, that framework of why people morally disengage and what are the factors involved becomes part of something that consulting firms can analyze and help deconstruct for their partners and others. I mean, in some ways you think that they would want to be mindful of that because of their fiduciary responsibility, that engaging in moral disengagement is actually bad for the bottom line down the line.
One would hope that bad behavior is rewarded with less money, but I don't have an answer to that, I guess. Do you?
Yeah, and I mean, we really didn't look very deeply into philosophical, foundations in moral issues. It's not our strong suit at all, which is why we're journalists, and why I didn't get my PhD.
Very low ceiling as a journalist.
We have low level of indignation, but also a low ceiling for philosophical discourse. Yeah. I'm sorry. I don't mean to take your question lightly. I just really have a hard time answering it. Yeah.
I see lots of hands. Please keep them up, but for the sake of time, let's keep questions short. And maybe a question that's coming in through Zoom.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so this is from someone on Zoom. Does McKinsey bring any value? In particular, why does our government need them? And don't tell me that they are smarter.
I mean, I do think McKinsey brings value in many instances.
Pardon me, go ahead.
And one I like, and Walt's going to roll his eyes about this, so one of the things McKinsey does that's very good is it is a diffuser of knowledge. It has a lot of expertise, and some places don't have the expertise, and they can pass that knowledge to other people. And the example I like to cite is actually in China. So China 20 years ago, now 30 years ago, was developing its insurance industry. It didn't know jack about insurance and how to run a big insurance company. And so it turned to McKinsey, and McKinsey worked for many, many, many years and still is.
And we know how well insurance works in this country,
yeah, I
don't
know.
we?
No, but I mean, you need...
I'm a big fan of big insurance.
You need insurance, right? And so McKinsey did work with this company, Ping An Insurance, for many, many decades. And they are now, one of the largest insurers in the world. And, China does have a fairly sophisticated insurance industry now, and it's thanks to companies like McKinsey that do pass on knowledge. So, there's no, we know McKinsey does things like that very good. They are, in many instances that backfires though. So if you read, and again, I'm not a finance professor or anything, but we did write a chapter on securitization. So another aspect of McKinsey that's kind of congruent to that is that they are when they learn something, they spread the good news, and you'll see this now if you read McKinsey emails. Now it's all about AI. 2 or 3 years ago it was about implementing DEI. So they do go with the trends,
It's sort of falling apart
Yeah,
there.
they do go with the hottest trends. And in the 80s there was this new thing called securitization, of real estate loans, securitization of auto loans, all these things. And McKinsey was spreading the good word and teaching banks how to securitize. And they didn't invent securitization, that's not, but they spread the idea. And that might be benign, but and they certainly didn't cause the global financial crisis. That's not McKinsey's fault, but they did spread that idea of securitization far and wide, and it led, it's certainly over a few years led to collateralized debt obligations and all these things which are kind of bastard childs of that. So I'm really not answering. So yeah, on the one hand, McKinsey's good in at diffusing knowledge. With the government, of course, they would say, that if the government's hollowed out and there's not a lot of, staff on the government, that's why oftentimes an agency will bring in McKinsey. And you guys are probably aware, just here in the Bay Area, with BART, BART decided to do consulting in-house for. I think was it just bringing in their new trains, new train system, and they wound up saving, without hiring outside consultants, saving hundreds of millions of dollars and delivering it ahead of time. So sometimes maybe bringing a consultant into a government agency or quasi-government agency is not the right thing.
Look, we pay taxes for the government to do its job. We're not paying taxes for the government to hire McKinsey to do its job. That's where I kind of have a problem.
Yeah.
I do want to push you all
Yeah.
in particular on this. It's clear that you're a little bit more of the pessimist when it comes to McKinsey and going forward. Is there something good that comes out of McKinsey?
Oh, I think a lot of good comes out of McKinsey. And I don't, we never said that it's all bad. I don't think that they're bad people by and large. I just think they need to do a better job at being accountable and being ethical. And no, the thing is, we don't know fully what they do because they don't talk. Well, not willing to talk about it.
Yeah, and sometimes it's well-intentioned. It just has bad effects, like put your client's interest above that of your firm. But what if the client is a bad actor? And another one is you can speak. Another value they have is the obligation to dissent. So some of the junior associates, they don't want to work for a coal company or an oil company or something, and you have that right at McKinsey. Say, I don't want to work in that sector. And McKinsey, I think, and you guys can tell me if I'm right, it generally honors that. The problem with that is it puts the moral decision, and maybe this does get kind of back to what you're saying. It puts the moral decision on an associate, not on a partner or a senior partner. So it's the associates that are making the moral decisions. And of course, by not working with an oil company, they may lose the chance to work with a really hot partner who's going places. So,
great. Other questions? Yes.
I haven't read the book, so forgive the uninformed question, but how would you say that McKinsey's work impacts our daily lives in ways that might surprise us?
In every way. Every way. From education to health to, it's just, that's why we decided to do the book, because if they're not hiding under your bed, they'll get there soon, It's frightening in a way. They advise every major pharmaceutical company basically in the world. At the same time, they're advising consulting for their regulators. We all take drugs, or at least, medicine, I should point out. I take medicine too much, actually. But, I just I feel quite uncomfortable with the fact that they're telling drug companies how to behave and what to do and how much to sell things for. At the same time, they're advising the regulators. So that affects it. They advise all the major hospitals. Every aspect of healthcare they're involved in. And now you may think that healthcare in this country is a fine-tuned machine. I don't subscribe to that opinion. So yeah,
so
they are
to be
everywhere.
specific though, so you're a poor person in Seattle, and you've gone to one of the Providence hospitals, and you get a bill in the mail, and you're getting calls from people at Providence Hospital, which is a nonprofit hospital chain, and and they're telling you, you've got to pay this bill, you've got to pay this bill, and you mortgage your house if you have a house. You probably don't because you're a poor person. You get some money from your friends, your relatives, or whatever, trying to pay this bill. You are not legally obligated to pay that bill. But McKinsey devised a system to get indigent people who had gone to Providence Hospital to pay when they were not obligated to pay. So if you want a specific example, and that might not be you, but it may be somebody you know, these are things they're doing. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to make sure we have time for one or two more questions before we wrap up. Yes.
Hi. There are two ways of reading the book. You can see it as first, you're surprised that McKinsey gets involved in so many of these decisions, or you can be surprised at the kind of questions that corporations and governments are asking McKinsey to help them solve. And I think for me that was the most striking. Less so what is McKinsey doing, but why are people concerned with making detention more efficient in the first place? And if you remove McKinsey, you just have that process being internalized. So I'm just trying to maybe work through what you make of that observation and where the ethical responsibility falls, and what is it a mirror? Is McKinsey simply a mirror of how the kinds of corporations we have in society?
It's a really good question. I mean, but to get to specifically on your ICE question, I think there's an answer in there. So they worked with ICE not just during the Trump administration and the first Trump administration. They were already working under the Obama administration for ICE, but into the Trump administration, not only they were trying to speed up the deportation process, but also try to cut costs for ICE. And they came up with this idea of there's ways we can cut costs by putting inmates or putting detainees in local county jails, sheriff's jails, and there's also ways we can cut food costs at ICE. And these were not things that the government had asked them to do. These are things that they had come up with, ideas. They were brainstorming ideas on how to save ICE money. And the pushback on these ideas came from within ICE. They were like, you can't do that. What are you doing, trying to save money on food? And you're trying to put people in these, detention facilities for ICE are bad enough, but local jails in Slidell, Louisiana, are pretty crappy places. And I think, the word actually one of the former ICE people told me was shitty. Okay, can I use a bad word here? And so, these are ideas though that McKinsey's coming up with, not the government. But your point well taken. Yes, sometimes the questions the government asking, are
I'm not entirely sure why governments feel the need to always turn to McKinsey or to, Bain or any other of the consulting companies. I would imagine, most of the people who go to help are not specifically trained in that area. And so you end up having these kids, I shouldn't say that, but young people, and sometimes it's important to bring fresh ideas and fresh eyes, I agree. But it's a reflective, that's the wrong word. It's done without thinking. Let's just bring in McKinsey. It's the quick, easy way to fix it. And the saying goes, no one ever got fired for hiring McKinsey. Maybe now, but not before. Look, I have high hopes for McKinsey being a better corporate citizen. I think I've seen some evidence of that, and I'm hopeful that it will continue in that direction.
And on that, we're coming up on time. I hope that many of the people in this room will be the ones who go steward that corporate responsibility at McKinsey and beyond.
And you know where to reach us if you find something good.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.